Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's special episode of the Maritime Morning Brief, brought to you by the Marine Exchange of Puget Sound. I am your host, Sarah, and I'm here with Executive Director Patrick Gallagher.
Good morning, everybody.
And today we are really excited to have Dr. Spencer Cohen, economics and trade policy expert and principal and founder of High Peak Strategy, LLC, here with us today. Welcome,
Good morning.
Spencer.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
It's good to have you here.
Really excited to have you. For everyone online, we've actually been chatting for like plenty of time already.
We're like
here in our
40
office.
minutes into our podcast unrecorded. So
Yeah.
we're just jumping in midway, actually.
Yeah, we're just jumping in. Patrick typically likes to start with a really crazy question. Do you have any lines?
I don't
up,
have
Patrick?
a crazy question, but I am curious because it's not often that we have like a real deal economist. So I am curious about what tariffs are doing to Washington State and when the global economy is going to collapse as a result.
Okay.
Just to start.
Just to kick things
Yeah,
off.
yeah.
Well, I think that there's pretty wide consensus that tariffs harm trade, right? I think for obvious reasons, in that tariffs are a tax on consumers and importers by definition and how they're structured. But I think that companies, they're able to adapt to conditions. We've seen a lot of, at least thus far, even with the first waves of tariffs that were put in place, or the escalated tariffs. Tariffs are always there, but wave of escalated tariffs on Chinese imports beginning Trump 1.0, and then continued and expanded under Biden, and now going on, rapidly expanding under Trump. Up until Liberation Day, companies were able to adapt to the tariffs and find ways to adjust to reflect, pass on some of the costs to consumers, but ultimately find ways to absorb some of those costs because they don't want to lose competitive edge with their domestic customer base. But what really rattles companies, I'm sure you've heard before, is just the uncertainty component. And when you have this constant yo-yo effect where, we started with this increase in tariffs on China, things remain relatively steady under Biden at elevated rates with some expansion on, for instance, electric vehicles from China, which doesn't even exist as a market. There's no market for EVs yet in the U.S. from China,
right.
But it was a preventative measure, to try to block and potentially incubate the growth of the industry, or one of many measures to incubate the growth in the U.S. But it was this, once Trump 2.0 kicked in Liberation Day, and you've heard the taco index.
Yep.
But that constant back and forth has been really rattling companies. And it really affects long-term planning, because most companies have a 5-year planning cycle, right? Where they're thinking about, especially for shippers, for BCOs, for companies involved in any way in international supply chains, where do you invest in your, where you expand, where you invest in your supply chains and overseas production? Where do you source goods? If just within the first year of the Trump administration, there's this much uncertainty and volatility in what the rates are, going China 30%, China 46%, China 150%, China down to 50%, and China reacting in retaliatory with their own retaliatory measures and their own export controls on critical minerals and so forth, rare earths. It's so hard to be able to plan, and the fixation on a deal. By the Trump administration is talking about, the possibility of grand bargain or deal at APEC coming up, next month. And this sort of bilateral discussion with China between Trump and Xi Jinping, for instance, to resolve some of these issues. But a deal is just a fleeting, ephemeral agreement. It's not a mechanism to resolve some of these broader trade disputes. And so we can get into that too, right? Why that's problematic. But that level of uncertainty, I think, is really rattling. And it really affects, even before Trump 2.0, companies were already thinking strategically about how to diversify their supply chains, right? So you saw hundreds of billions of dollars in investments being made by Chinese companies, for instance. Not all of them were actually enacted because of the new rules that come in, uncertainty and a lot of other volatility and upheaval that's been going on, tumult. But Chinese companies in the EV space and the battery space, and even beyond that in furniture, were making announcements from Mexico, for instance, that they're going to invest in a lot of manufacturing capacity in Mexico. You saw a lot of companies through what they called a China plus one strategy diversify outside China into Vietnam.
Right.
A lot of that was reflected in factors that went beyond tariffs. So, overall geopolitical concerns of being too reliant upon China or too risk, trying to de-risk or being too vulnerable to China or changes in the geopolitical relationship, but also labor costs been rising in China since 2010. There's other factors too. But then, so that's already been happening. But even those plans have been thrown a bit into a bit of a tumultuous state or volatile state because of all the uncertainty about what the rate's ultimately going to be. So there's more to unpack there, but I'll pause there.
I think about, so listening to you, there's two things that I think about immediately. One is the smaller players, so who that collectively play an important part, but I think it's very likely that smaller players are going to suffer worse. To me, it just seems logical because let's say you're a small time importer, right? And you just talked about, it goes from 35% to 100% to 50%. Can you imagine being the importer that paid 100% tariff and then the next day it was 50%? They just don't have the same kind of pocket that some of the larger importers would. So there's one fear. No, I'll just kind of like mark that. And I'm curious to see if there's any data. It might, I'm sure it's going to lag quite a bit. I'm sure there's a lot you don't know right now in terms of data. So there's that. And then the second thing, and referring back to our conversation with Sam Kaplan, who is here, and he talked about the rising labor costs in China. And I'm wondering if now that's a major play, because I know we've shifted off to Vietnam quite a bit, and I know we have here locally as well. After Trump 1.0, there was a lot more diversification in this local market. So I'm curious. I'd like to kind of pick your brain on that in terms of the rising labor costs overseas. So there's two things.
I'll start. So definitely agree with you on the exposure for smaller importers. Definitely the fact that and it's not just like it's not just things that. So there are certain like commodities and goods that China has essentially cornered the market in. And it's not just rare earths and, magnets, right, and other kind of key inputs for battery technology, but it's also like coaxial cables, like coaxial cables, even certain kinds of basic hardware. China has such an overwhelming concentration, like 90% are being built in China. And so you can't really, a lot of companies, they have a relatively inelastic demand for those goods, right? Meaning they can't just respond based on the prices, how much they consume of it. They need it no matter what, and they're gonna have to eat those costs. So if you're a small business and these are basic inputs you need, you're going to have to just eat those costs, and it's going to represent a bigger part of your overall budget, right? You don't have the reserves that a lot of these larger companies might have.
Right.
On the labor cost piece, so definitely since 2010 roughly is when China started to see. So for a long time, you had this phenomenon for decades where ever since China opened up in the late 70s, early 80s, where you had increasing output in the economy, everything was growing, but labor costs were lagging behind. And a big reason for that was the fact that you just had such an enormous surplus of rural labor that these are that were migrants moving to the cities. They can't permanently settle in the cities. They have an internal passport system that prevented them from permanently settling in the cities and raising families in the cities, but they would work in these factories under really, conditions improved a lot, but sweatshop conditions at first, and it's still hard. It's still a hard job, but
right.
You had this huge influx of underemployed workers from the countryside, because once you opened up in the farms became more efficient because you dismantled the commune system, replaced with a collective system, opened up rural markets. So you had a much more efficient and rapidly growing ag system, and you didn't need all these extra workers.
Sounds very reminiscent of the United States, say, pre-industrialization around the 20s and 30s.
Totally.
That sounds very similar.
Yeah, it's a common phenomenon. In fact, there was a famous economist named Arthur Lewis who actually coined the term Lewis turning point. That is a theory that describes this phenomenon where you have all this excess labor. So what China's experiencing is not unusual. What was unusual was how concentrated, how underemployed these workers were because of the communist system that was in place prior to opening up. And so once it opened up, you had this huge influx of rural labor moving to the countryside. out of the countryside to the cities or industrial bases. And so you had this lag where labor costs stayed low, even though overall output was increasing at a very fast rate. So in other words, labor productivity was high, but wages were not reflecting that increase in productivity. And so that started to change though around 2010. And part of it, so that started to change. There was a moment or period where you started to finally see the increase in labor lag, the increase in new labor entering the labor market for these lagging overall demand. So you begin to see a little bit of that increase, as you saw less growth in labor, wages started to increase over time. And that's kind of what happened around 2010.
So where's the new, what's the next China? Is it India? Like, where's the new labor arbitrage in the world?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the challenges is going to be that, China opened up at a really specific moment in history. That was really the 1970s following stagflation, and you had, increased mobility of capital, really that next phase. It wasn't the first phase, but it was a next phase of globalization. China opened up at the right time. And China has been really good at, even though they've seen labor costs increasing, if you look at all of the new installations of robotics, you look at all of the new investments that are happening and building out these really robust ecosystems of suppliers, that's really hard to just to move. So while India logically might be the next place, and India has benefited, from Foxconn, which is the major manufacturer of iPhones, for instance, the Taiwanese company, they've invested in factories in India. Other companies have. I almost wonder, if I was an Indian economic planner, I would be a little concerned that China is, maybe we missed the moment. And China has been really good. Over half the industrial robots installed in the world are in China. So they're making up for those losses or those lost competitive edge in labor costs by really helping in these, investing heavily in robotics. There's whole factories now, like EV factories in China that are dark factories where there's no employees. They're literally, it's just,
Really?
it's pretty amazing. I mean, the level of automation that China's invested in, to help, one, to stay competitive and also to offset, as part of that, rising labor costs and the inability to find workers is pretty astounding. So India, yes, could be the next place. India has its own problems. I'm not an expert in India, but my understanding of India is there's still lots of provincial level protectionism. Infrastructure is a big challenge. There's a whole slate of issues they have to overcome, institutional as well as other capital investments, infrastructure investments, to be able to be the next locale or for those investments. Vietnam has benefited from a lot of that sort of expansion or diversification, but Vietnam is only a country of I think 80 million people. China's 1.4 billion. So there's only so much capacity Vietnam could absorb over time in terms of additional manufacturing capacity. So again, I think, I think it's going to be India could be, but I think it's going to be a big challenge. You're also seeing Latin America. A lot of companies, U.S. is still the dominant domestic, market for a lot of Chinese goods. So diversifying to Latin America has also been a kind of a next move as well. But
yeah, I was going to say something along those lines. Well, that we just kind of got a 101 on some of these other takes on what has happened kind of in the history of trade in China, for example. So what are, as not an economic trade expert, what is kind of the American history for that has laid the foundation for where we are right now? And then also, aside from the tariff uncertainty, what are things that you spend time thinking about in regards to here and what happens, maybe even here in Washington?
So 2 great questions. Let me try to tackle the first one first. So if I understand your question correctly too, just make sure I understand it. So what were some of the events that led up to the U.S. reaction to?
Yeah. Sure.
Probably start there. So definitely, I think, so if you look at manufacturing as a share of U.S. employment and, beginning around 1980, there's been a pretty steady decline. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I visualized I've seen the chart so many times now, I can easily visualize it, but it's a pretty linear with a few bumps here and there, but it's
Uh-huh.
pretty linear negative slope, beginning around 1980 and declining all the way through at least the financial crisis. There's a little bit of an adjustment, some pickup, but generally there's been a big shift in the US economy away from manufacturing. Manufacturing output declined much less than that. So we saw huge increases in US productivity, but in terms of a share of like the labor force, in terms of employment, we've seen a big decline. And that's affected, we've heard a lot about like the Rust Belt, and we've heard a lot about regions of the US that have been really, there was what was called the China shock, which was a term that was several years back, was coined by a couple economists on the East Coast. And it really reflects this dramatic change in the sort of the mobility of those jobs in the capital, where you saw a lot of that move out, and those regions that were impacted were replaced by services jobs that didn't pay anywhere near as much. So you had a lot of carving out of the industrial base, which started before China too. I mean, the maquiladoras in Mexico were that first wave of globalization as well, and that movement of capital to Mexico and other low-cost regions. So I think that, and also married to that is a lot of, I think, policymakers had a misunderstanding about what globalization would mean for our relationship with China and what China might become. I don't think a lot of people thought China was going to become a democracy because of trade, but they thought it would become less authoritarian, less autocratic, more predictable, right? We kind of bring China into our system of governance and global rules and multilateralism, and that would make China behave in a more predictable way, in a way that would be, we'd still have our challenges, but we would find ways China would largely abide by the same rules, and it wouldn't be disruptive. It would kind of moderate, its behavior. And so that was kind of the case until about 2012. And then when President Xi took the helm, you've seen a big shift in China domestically to a much more authoritarian state. And you've also seen China really throw its weight around in other parts of the world, like the South China Sea, for instance. It's been much more saber rattling, certainly in its relations intermittently with Japan, over the Diaoyu Islands, and then, of course, the Taiwan Strait. And so it's not, and I think there was a lot of disillusionment with what we thought China how it might behave, and how trade did not yield the kind of geopolitical benefits that a lot of people thought it might. So I think that all kind of brewed together. And also just a lot of, the financial crisis really amplified and accelerated a lot of, I think, in the US domestically, frustration with the existing economic order, and a lot of anger and looking to shake things up. And I think Trump definitely tapped into that resentment in the financial crisis. So I think that all built up to wanting to do something different. I'm not suggesting, I don't agree with how Trump's approaching it, but I think there was definitely a lot of built up frustration with the relationship and with the role of trade, and also that the inefficacy of a lot of the institutions that were there. I think there was a lot of frustration that the WTO was not serving. WTO, China was still always classified as a developing country in the WTO. And so there were rules that were different for China because of its status in the WTO. And so I think a lot of the institutions as well were not serving or not reflecting the realities as they were in 2000, maybe in 2001 when China, ascended to the WTO, but not later on. On your second question, though, I'm sorry, what was your question again?
I don't even remember either, actually.
It was a really interesting question.
Oh, it's bringing it back home.
Oh,
to
yeah.
Washington
What's the
State.
outside perspective for
Right,
us
yeah.
right now?
I think, and you might have heard Sam talk about this too, and others, but I think about the P&W, and I think about our port system as part of a gateway, right? That's the common kind of, right? Like, you all use that terminology as well. It's really not about a singular port, but it's about the gateway. It's about the ecosystem of, there's a couple benefits. One, it's an ecosystem of service providers and types of services, right? Whether it's transloading, warehousing, intermodal stuff, rail, drayage. There's a whole bunch of activities that are really interconnected, right? Involved in the movement of marine cargo, whether it's containers, bulk, break bulk, and so forth, liquid bulk. And so that system is built on and has expanded over the decades on a relationship with Northeast Asia, right? We talk about, Seattle, for instance, or the PNW has been largely the gateway in the U.S. And if you even more broadly, the PNW, including the British Columbia ports, has really constituted a very robust gateway for cargo, mostly on the import side from Asia, some exports as well, but certainly on the import side with containers, and largely more recently driven by growth in China and the economic emergence of China and that trade relationship. So, and that system's really critical. I mean, I actually did some work for SAM's organization, the Center of Excellence in Global Trade Supply Chain Management. And, we estimated just in terms of direct jobs that are across Washington state alone, so not the whole PNW, but just Washington state, that are involved in trade and supply chain management, you're looking at close to 100,000 jobs, including everything from longshoremen to logistics managers and freight forwarders to truck drivers and so on and so on. So that system, and those are really good paying jobs. Those are high paying jobs. A lot of them don't require a college degree, so you can make a family wage job, live in this region, with a vocational training, certificate training, and what have you. But so much of the cargo moving through on the container side is discretionary cargo. It's not destined for the PNW. Ultimately, it's destined for like Minnesota or Chicago, elsewhere in the interior, in the hinterland. So as the economy changes, as trade changes, that could have a profound impact on our region. Because the other thing too is the more we have a robust, imports support job growth in the region, but exports create import of capital, right? The more you sell stuff from here, the more it's an import of capital. Thinking about it as a from terms of like economic impacts and regional economic impacts, when you export something, that represents an importation of capital, which is then spent throughout the economy, spent by workers, it's on on buying goods and services, it's spent on suppliers. So having that robust ecosystem that imports stuff helps to subsidize the cost of exporting things. The more empty containers you have in that imbalance, that does actually make it cheaper then for local businesses to be able to ship their stuff via container on the export side. So that's really important. And so as you have changes in the economy, as you could see in these global trade relations, we talked a little bit about the diversification piece. If you have a reduction in trade with China and you have more trade shifting to other parts of the world, that could represent a reduction in trade volumes through the PNW.
We're seeing a lot of, I was looking at the Northwest Seaport Alliance numbers, the data that they publish, and the amount of empties. From my understanding, it's a record number of empties, and so I think that's definitely a concern. But it kind of speaks to what you're talking about, as things are changing here locally.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure anyone's got a good prediction. Do you have one?
I mean, it's too early to. I mean, I do think that I'm kind of in the middle on this. Like, I think the doomsday, for lack of a better term, the extreme doomsday example would be that we're going to see a dramatic cutoff of trade with China, and then all that stuff is either going to repatriate or is going to diversify to other countries, more likely the case, in terms of manufacturing capacity, and it's going to require a different gateway strategy. So you could see, for instance, if you see more stuff going to India, if that happens, like most of the terminals for container terminals in India are on the West Coast. So once the Houthi rebel crisis kind of calms down a bit more, it's starting to, but who knows, right? I mean, and so
2 years plus. With this, I think.
Once that eventually settles down, hopefully eventually settles down, if you're manufacturing something in India, you're not going to ship through the PNW most likely. I mean, you could for some markets like LA Long Beach, because that is a huge domestic market you want to serve. But for discretionary cargo, you're going to probably go through the Suez Canal. You're going to go to the East Coast. You might go through the Gulf. If you see a lot of stuff in Latin America, go to Latin America. You could see a lot of stuff move from Latin America again, entering the U.S. to the Gulf ports. So to serve the Midwest market. So if that happens, that could really further complicate the Washington State port's position, and their strategic competitiveness. And then on top of all of that, of course, you have the Canadian ports that have their own built-in advantages with the absence of something like a harbor maintenance tax.
Right.
And as well as just, other benefits as well. I mean, just generally cost of moving things through Canada is cheaper, especially through rail from Prince Rupert or from Vancouver, onto rail to the Midwest. So
Yeah, I have this. I think it's in my bag actually. I have this map that I found in this office when I took over this job that has all the rail in North America, and it was extremely enlightening to look at what the rail infrastructure in Canada, where the spurs are and where the transfers are. And it's like, yeah, I get it. I totally understand it. And of course, Canada has invested a lot. So we suffer from lost market share with Canada. And, a lot of people point to the rail infrastructure that we're not really investing in here locally, not nearly as much as they have in Canada. So I have another question.
Oh.
It's about you, though.
Okay, before I
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
one additional thought. Sorry,
No, go ahead.
you get me going.
Yeah, no, that's you're here to get going, so it's okay.
One more unstructured thought.
No, it's good.
So like the one benefit. So that was the doomsday scenario. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that there'll be some rejigging of supply chains, but China is too big, and China has too many built-in like ecosystems of suppliers that you can't just uproot, and those systems can't just decamp and go to like India or elsewhere. There's too many built-in legacy investments and there's too much inertia in those ecosystems, in my opinion, to just replace them. There might be some eroding of that competitiveness. There might be some reduction in trade, but it's not going to go away. So the PNW will still be a relevant gateway for that trade. It just won't be as much as it has been historically. The other thing is that historically, the last 10, 15 years, the PNW is one of the most dynamic, fastest growing regional economies in the U.S. So even if you have a reduction in that discretionary trade going to Chicago through our gateway, you will have still demand locally. And we've actually seen, if I look at the numbers, it's been a while, but it appears as if there has been some shift more and more towards that non-discretionary cargo that's destined for the PNW as the final destination. So even if we're losing that cargo moving to Chicago, for instance, or elsewhere in the Midwest, we are, as one of the fastest growing regions in the country, in terms of our local market, there will be some, it's not going to completely offset that, but it will to some degree potentially offset some of those losses. So
I had not heard that anywhere else. But that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So if you haven't heard anywhere else, I could be completely, it could be a totally new idea, or it could be completely wrong. That's why no one said that before. So we'll see.
Well, so one more question on that is the other kind of doomsday idea that has circulated, right, with the crazy tariffs is that, well, what if people just start going around the U.S. altogether? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's another doomsday scenario.
Maybe we don't think that one's going to happen either, but what is your hot take?
I mean, I think, if you add up, all it's really hard for countries to coordinate. And so in theory, right, yeah, I've thought about this too, right? It's like, well, what if in response to, what if the EU, for instance, was able to have a coordinated strategy and even work with other either blocks of countries or individual large countries. But I think the way that they've been so eager to arrive at a deal has been reflected the fact that it's so hard, even within the EU bloc itself, to be able to have a robust response or way to kind of deal with it other than trying to negotiate. It's just so hard to coordinate a response. I think the U.S., we'll see. It's certainly, the problem too is like China is its own problem. It's not as if, as much as countries are having challenges with the U.S. right now, it's not as if China's a better partner. China, for a number of reasons, with having to do with its political system, having to do with its use of export controls for political, when China, for instance, when they had, dispute with Japan over a series of islands, like the Diaoyu Islands or Konkaku Islands that have been disputed, they just turned off access to rare earths back in 2010, 2011. It was 2011. And so they have that, and they've done similar things with Australia where there was a think tank in Australia, I think government-funded think tank that was kind of ruffling feathers because it was bringing up issues around Xinjiang, like in the kind of the forced labor and like re-education camps for Uyghurs, bringing up that issue, and then also questioning like where the origins of COVID, things like that. And so they just they blocked imports of like Australian wine, for instance. So they've demonstrated on their own that they've also been able to employ coercive tactics outside the normal sort of agreed upon rules to manipulate trade for their own, or use trade to impose. So they're not proven to be a better actor necessarily.
Profit is not necessarily the motivator for China. I think that's something that that's so deeply embedded into our culture that that's not something we necessarily think about. Well, not the lay person. I think at more of a geopolitical spectrum for sure, but I don't think that's something that has made it down into the everyday culture here in America.
Yeah, and that's both not the most reassuring idea, but also a really reassuring idea to hear in the midst of all the kind of chaos. Is that other people got stuff going on too, so that's actually nice to hear.
I mean, the EU's got like they're worried because they have their own burgeoning EV industry, and the effect of the U.S. blocking a lot of these blocking Chinese EVs, since they're worried about in other products, they're worried about, especially on stuff that's already was pretty abundant, or there's abundant trade in the U.S. is if it gets blocked by high tariffs, it's going to flood into their markets, right? And so they're worried. They have the same. There's this ripple effect, so they're also worried about it. I mean, and of course, China's been a big supporter of Russia, and at odds, obviously, with most European countries on Ukraine, and so being kind of enabling a lot with other countries, enabling Russian activities, or at least supporting it. So, I mean, it's not as if they're a better partner, So countries have to weigh, do we want to really go all in on the China side? Because you kind of have to choose. There's no third way if you're going to start choosing, leaning, attacking to one side or another. So
two things that are rattling around in my head. One is maybe this is in reverse order, but your thoughts on the Northern Sea route and China exploiting this new route that saves 10 or 12 days that circumvents some of the geopolitical problems. And then number two, do you speak Chinese?
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear about that.
I don't know as much. I know I know a cursory amount about the northern route.
Okay.
Like this is the North Passage. I think certainly it's faster, right? It's a faster route. It gets to certainly European markets faster. It helps to avoid all of the issues around the Suez Canal, right? So, and other areas too, right? I mean, they are, when you're, again, I don't think the U.S. and China are going to go to war, right? But nonetheless, I mean, the Western Pacific is still the domain of the U.S. Navy. And so having Chinese vessels being able to go in directions where there's not as many U.S. Navy vessels, right, is probably preferred as well, I'm guessing, for a variety of reasons. So certainly I could see there being benefits to having access to that. I'd be worried if I was Russia, though, because as much as the China relationship is really close right now, I mean, they have long-standing historical tensions going back, pre-Cold War even. We're talking during the Tsarist Russia, we're talking Qing Dynasty, Tsarist Russia. I mean, there's always been challenges, and Russia is a revisionist power, right, or revanchist power, the term is. China's an ascendant power. Russia has a lot of land that's not used and a lot of resources. So I'm kind of curious how much Russia wants to become dependent on China, which would undermine a lot of their long-term. But that's another topic. But I think on the second question, so I digress. Go so many directions. But so I studied Chinese.
Yeah. Tell us about that. Tell us. How about this? Give us your backstory. How did you? Well, not your entire backstory, but the highlights that brought you, all the way into this position. And I know you're the founder of High Peak. Is that correct? Can you talk to us about, a little bit about yourself and how this happened?
So I'll try to be succinct. It's not like it's an exciting story, but just there's details. So I got interested in China when I was an undergrad, and
where was that?
At University of Connecticut.
Oh, okay.
I'm from Connecticut. And
Okay.
so I got interested in China from, when I was in college. I was a math and history double major. And so confused.
Okay.
Yeah, different
So,
sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, I didn't see that
Switching both
coming.
sides. And I got really interested. I took some Chinese history courses and really just got really excited about the topic and really interested. And so I took my senior year, I took Chinese language, but this is back in 2001. And there wasn't enough demand to justify a course back then, which is crazy because like 10 years later, you couldn't even get into a Chinese language course. They were so overbooked. But at the time at least, so it got my interest. It piqued my interest enough to like want to go, like I learned independent study class, but then it piqued my interest enough to like want to go learn more and really commit really invest the time to learn Chinese. And so I ended up deciding, I had an opportunity. I went to teach English in China after college. And that was really just a mechanism or means for me to be immersed in the culture. I'd never been abroad before. So it was like my first time other than like the Bahamas once. So
I did that in South Korea.
There you
Same
go.
thing. Yeah, I taught English for a year.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you know how it goes. Yeah. And for me, it was like just a means of being there, right? So, and I studied with a tutor, and then eventually, I eventually matriculated into like a formal language program in the city I was living in the Northeast, and took like formal like structured classes, like 18 hours a week. And then I just kept on building. So I became enthralled with living there, and I loved the culture, and I loved the history, and it was just constant. This was in the early aughts, so it was like just constant stimulation. It's like you're always seeing something new. You're always getting excited about something. You're learning something new every day. And I just dove like head first, like just into learning Chinese and committed myself to that. And then I moved to Seattle to go get my master's in China studies. And then from that, I took some time off, and then I went back for my PhD. I actually did my PhD in geography, but with the focus on economic geography and political economy. So I studied and I looked at, my research was on land markets in China and state enterprise debt and local government debt issues. So I was really interested in kind of the local political economy in China. And so I did that, but I decided not to pursue a career in academia. So I ended up going, while I was working on my PhD and I was in the dissertation writing phase, I went back to work and kind of worked while finishing my PhD,
Wow.
which extended the amount of time it took to finish my PhD, but I got it done. Yeah, and then I worked for the state government for a while, and then I ended up working in a couple different positions, and then I worked for a consulting firm in Seattle, and then during that time working in the consulting firm, I finished my PhD. I also took time off to do field work in China, so I went to China and did interviews and like site visits, because looking at the role of like local government finance vehicles or local state enterprises, and the role they played in using land as an asset for borrowing money on behalf of governments. It was kind of an interesting triangulation of those different, governments and land banks and local banks and state local government. And so I finished that, and then in 2020, I just decided I would really want to start my own consulting firm for a long time, and I was like really thinking about it, and I just wanted to be entrepreneurial, and finally, one might think that 2020 was not a good year to start a company, but like, in a weird way, it kind of like working from home kind of like gave me the confidence I could do it, because I'm already doing it, right?
Yeah.
I'm working, like I work from home now. It's like, right, my global headquarters is my house. Yeah, and I went and started my company in 2020, and yeah, it's been great. And I do, a lot of my focus is on a kind of a variety of, I do a lot of port projects. So I've done a lot of work for ports and for port authorities and other port adjacent or customers and organizations. So I've done work this year, even the last couple of years, like I've done work in Florida for Port Tampa Bay, for some inland port infrastructure projects also in Florida. I worked on a marine cargo forecast in North Carolina recently. I've done work in California for ports there. I've done work in Texas, Louisiana, Georgia. I've done work for the Georgia Port Authority as well as other organizations. So it's been really cool, and stuff Port of Maryland as well. And then I do a lot of that's like highest and best use analysis for port investments, for land use, strategic decision making with like the economic focus or informing strategic investments and decision making, and marine cargo forecasting, and other kind of various things. Like I've done some stuff around pilotage in Florida as well. So that's like a big part of what I do. And then I also do a lot of other stuff. Also in Washington State. So Port of Seattle, I work for them right now. I've recently worked with the Washington Public Ports Association.
Oh yeah.
So
Eric.
Work with Eric.
Yeah.
Work with Eric, and also Washington Maritime Federation.
Yeah. That's
Washington
where.
County.
Yeah, that's you did our reports.
That's right.
Yeah.
First
2 years
connection
ago,
with
right?
you,
Yeah. I was working with a partner with McKinley Research Group on that.
Right.
Yep.
And that's also too, like I do a lot of work with other consultants. So I do stuff that's like standalone. Like I did a project for Port Angeles that was like a standalone, but a lot of projects I collaborate with other consulting firms, which is really fun. It's great because being able to work in a team, you know, and being able to collaborate with other smart people. Like I do a lot of work with McKinley Research Group, another firm called Burke. I work with a couple economists on the East Coast, like Walter Kempsey's is an economist I work with quite a bit out of Savannah, and a colleague of ours, Derek Cutler at EBP in Boston. So we work a lot together. So it's really fun in that way. But then I also do a lot of other stuff too, like economic impact studies and economic development projects. So like the work I've done with Sam Kaplan has been around, we collaborate a lot on economic development strategies. So we've done that for Snohomish County, Port of Seattle right now, working with their economic development division. So that's kind of
That's awesome.
Yeah, and all kinds of just little variety of other stuff too. That's all economic impact or economic analysis related type projects.
So speaking of highest and best use of port infrastructure, what do you think of the Seattle City Council vote? Sorry, I didn't make eye contact with you. So I wanted to get the whole question out. But anyway, go ahead. Thoughts? Your thoughts?
Well, okay. I'm actually involved for the port, so
Yeah.
I think it's very short-sighted. So I think that there are better solutions out there. I appreciate where they're coming from. I understand, like, you know, Seattle does have a housing shortage.
Yep.
It is a huge issue. There's a lot of, you know, we see a lot of homelessness that's kind of one kind, right? Which are people that have drug addictions or mental health issues or both. That's very real and very visible. But there's also this broader homelessness issue around people who don't have those problems, but are just simply cannot afford to live in the city.
Yeah.
And oftentimes there's a pipeline where people who, because they can't afford they work here, but they can't afford a home, they sleep in their cars, which exposes them to potential violence, to exposure to drugs, and it's a pipeline almost. And there's been a lot of good work that's been done showing how we really do have a real housing shortage, right? So I appreciate where they're coming from, and I feel like they've kind of identified the problem. Yeah. But I feel like my opinion is that by removing industrial land, the long-term impact could be quite devastating for the gateway. And our port system at Gateway is already a bit under siege because of what's happening with the global trade environment and with Canadian ports and the advantages they have. And a lot of also, I mean, just even LA Long Beach with this big new Barcelona International Gateway. So all the big investments in inland port infrastructure.
Yep.
These are all things that are challenging, and many other things too, right? That are aggressively challenging the competitiveness of our ports. And our ports and that gateway infrastructure ecosystem creates jobs for people who don't need a college degree, right? Don't have a college degree, you can make a decent living and live in the city. So I think it's short-sighted is the short answer.
Yeah.
I think that's well said.
I think that's very well said. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Very,
Okay.
very succinct. That's a really good answer. So
Yeah.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
Most definitely. You gonna ask about the band now?
Yeah.
All right.
Now I gotta know.
Okay.
So this is pre-podcast banter. Now I need to know. Tell us about your band.
Okay. So it's just for fun. I have no aspirations.
You don't have to downplay it.
No
for us.
delusions about.
You don't have to downplay it.
I like just making noise. I play music with a couple of guys. I play guitar. My friends play drums and bass, and so we're called Silver Ships Plastic Oceans.
Oh,
Maritime.
Which is somewhat
Fantastic.
derived. It's maritime, but it's also derived. It's a slight bastardization of some lyrics in a Black Sabbath song. So, but yeah, no, we So
how long have you been playing guitar?
Well, I've been playing guitar since I was like in my early teens. I've never been serious about it, and I wouldn't say I'm serious now, but I'm definitely much more serious about it over the last like 5, 6, 7 years.
How long have
So
you been playing guitar, Patrick?
Oh gosh. Similar. I think I picked it up in high school.
yeah,
Was in a band. Was convinced I was gonna, this was it. Metal was my life. But so interesting story related to you too, Sarah. Is I was the editor of my high school newspaper,
okay,
and so my family fame is that I got a full ride scholarship to a private school for journalism,
oh cool,
and gave it up because I was going to be a metal god,
okay,
and my parents were pissed.
Yeah.
They were nonplussed,
okay,
and so I took a gap year and then decided that wasn't going to work out. But
Yeah.
this is what's great about this industry, though. This is what's great about the maritime industry.
This is the official invite for everyone who owns a guitar to bring it to our open house in January.
that would be.
And some kind of chaos will ensue, and there will be guitars and beer,
All right.
and
those are always
that
good.
will be
It'll
our
be
open
beautiful.
house. Yeah.
Can I
Official
ask
invite.
what metal were you into?
Well, so I mean, this is a while ago. So back then, like being into Metallica and Slayer and
Yeah,
Megadeth was like pretty edgy. Now it's not.
Back then, yeah.
Metallica is the most main. That's as mainstream as you can get right now. But those are my, But yeah, metal, Iron
Yeah.
Maiden,
Oh, yeah.
Black Sabbath,
Yeah,
all of that.
yeah. I just saw Iron Maiden.
Did you
They were
really?
at Tacoma Dome recently.
Oh yeah, that
Last
was
year.
last year.
Yeah.
I saw Metallica both nights. I spent so much money, and it was one of those things where it's like, this is it. I see Metallica maybe 6 or 7 times.
Nice.
As
Yeah.
early back as the '80s, late '80s.
Yeah.
And so I was like, this is it. I'm just gonna
That
spend
was the
the money.
Injustice for All era.
Yeah, yeah. So right before Injustice for All, I ended up seeing them twice, I think, and then huge gap, and then I saw them a few other times.
Nice.
Once in Seattle.
Yeah.
I feel pretty lucky though. Like I lived here in Seattle in the early '90s, so I saw all the grunge bands that were that, and of course back then I thought it was no big deal. It was just like Friday, but there you are, watching Soundgarden at the OK Hotel. Turns out that was
Yeah.
pretty epic.
Yeah.
I
Nice.
just didn't know it, so I thought it was just whatever. This is what
Yeah.
we do. So
Wow.
yeah.
Quick, someone make a tie from punk metal to maritime.
Oh yeah.
I think there's lots of time. I feel maritime is so this industry itself is so it's very welcoming to all the wayward people. It's kind of everything. I always feel like, well, you can find yourself somewhere in this industry, and this is what I end up saying a lot to a lot of people. But it's to me, it's why it's so beautiful. It's so welcoming and open that anybody should be able to find themselves. This is when we, these ideas that we would ever restrict it for anybody or it's for, old white dudes or whatever. It's like, I don't know. I don't buy it. I think it's for everybody. So,
It's
look at you. Like,
Well-
you've got the wildest story. You start in Connecticut, go to China, get a PhD. Now I'm in Seattle. Now I work with all these ports around the world. It's like, that's a crazy
Yeah.
story.
It's pretty fun.
It's a great story. I
would
love
also
it.
add I'm not sure it entirely answers your question, but like still probably in one of my all-time favorite metal songs is "Rhyming the Ancient Mariner."
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
your metal maritime connection.
Can you sing a
Nice.
little bit of it?
No.
You have to come to the party for that one.
Or you have to come down.
If
That's in
when I
January.
sing, it sounds like I'm still going through puberty. Do not do that.
That's great. That is
Oh,
so great.
geez. All right. Well, I think one of my final questions is: do you have any words of wisdom for the industry right now?
Critical point,
Yeah.
right? Things
A
are changing.
takeaway.
That's a good
Yeah.
question.
I think like there's still, there's a lot of things happening that I still feel like despite all the kind of painting a somewhat, I won't say slightly pessimistic picture maybe, but like there's still a lot of huge opportunity in the sector in our region. So, for example, there's this big push for expanding shipyard capacity in the U.S. And, for a lot of things, we're not going to be competitive because the labor costs and other costs like in the Gulf are so much cheaper than here. But there's still going to be opportunities to potentially take advantage of a lot of the big movements. I mean, so the USTR rules that kicked in last week on that are targeting Chinese-built vessels and Chinese operators, Chinese carriers, that's rattled the industry a bit, although it's scaled back from what it originally was going to be. Like the first salvo of that was like way more draconian and costly for businesses, but that's been scaled back. It's still there. It's still a cost that's being borne. It's intended to discourage, China to try to, in some indirect way, address the long-term sustained advantage China's had in building large vessels. But there's the Ships Act that's still being, I think, still being legislated or being negotiated, right? There's versions of it out there. There's other types of actions that are potentially moving through Congress whenever Congress, functions again. So there is this kind of like large shifts towards trying to promote more domestic shipyard capacity. And while we're not going to build the large vessels here, but we obviously have a large ecosystem of medium-sized shipyards. And so there could be an opportunity there. And so what do you need to do to like get ahead of that, right? Take advantage. Well, we hear all the time from shipyards about, things you guys have probably come across too, right? You've heard about lack of like welders, other kinds of qualified workers, the difficulty finding those kind of workers and those skills. So trying to like invest in policies that, which has been often the conversation in Olympia, to be fair, and here in Seattle, but how do you address those gaps? And part of it is like, how do you make those jobs? It's not just the wage per se, but it's, it comes back to affordability. Like a lot of people, you can't live in Seattle and do those jobs. So
Right.
how do you address that issue as well? So,
Well, we're on Wednesday, we're going to have Thule Snow here from Snow, the boat builders. I know they just landed a rather significant contract, I believe, with the Navy. And we'll ask her about that. But I imagine she'll have a lot to say about that because she's in it. She's working those issues every day. So that's a good insight.
I mean, I'm still optimistic about the industry overall.
Me too.
Yeah,
I
feel
know
good about it. It's just facing these challenges, right, in the near term. So.
Yeah, I'm incredibly bullish on Washington Maritime. I know it. I look at cargo reports and I see the challenges clearly, and we quantify those things with the ship count and where it's been going for. Well, we've been doing it for 45 years, so we know, we can see where things are happening. We monitor it pretty closely. Don't always know what it means. I don't have all of the context. That's why I talk to smart people like you to try and fill in some of those gaps and some of the anomalies that we see in trends. But overall, yeah, I'm with you. I'm incredible. I have a very positive outlook on the industry here in this state. I just see so much potential. I really do. I share
You all
that.
are awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we're getting close to rounding out here. Final note, Spencer, where can people stay in touch with you, find you if they're interested in that?
Yeah, people can always reach out to me so they can email me. I'm happy to share my email. That's
Great.
Or
Yeah.
LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn is a great place. Yeah.
LinkedIn's always a good place. If they want to email me directly, it's just spencer@highpeakstrategy.com.
There you go.
I need to update my website. It's a bit dated now, but they can always go to highpeakstrategy.com or just like email me directly or find me on LinkedIn.
Great.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen.
Just Spencer.
Thank you for
We
being
got it. Come on, you did that.
No, you get it.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for
I know your
coming on.
time is extremely precious, and so for you to come here and spend it with us means a lot to us. So
Well,
thank you.
Thank you for inviting me and the very stimulating conversation,
Yeah,
and
it was
also
great.
the great tour of
Yeah.
the Marine Exchange.
We really
So,
appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you at the Economic Forecast Breakfast.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
next week.
Yeah,
I'll be
that'll
there.
be exciting.
That's next week.
Yeah, 29th.
Okay.
See you all
we need to-
there.
We need to get on that. Okay.
Well, yeah. Thanks again so much, Spencer. And we will be connected, I'm surely, much in the future as well. I'm hoping to get you in our annual report. So wait for that to come through.
Yeah.
All right. With that, everyone, I think we're going to close out this special episode of the Maritime Morning Brief. And we look forward to seeing you all again bright and early tomorrow morning.